difference between bootstrapping and autonomy is extremely important because, autonomy is, I want to have control over my life. I want to have control over my destiny. I want to have a say over what happens to me. That can be taken away from you by things like the free market or when it's working against you. And so what I'll often say to conservatives is, okay, we can agree a national minimum wage won't work, but what are you doing?
Let's go.
Welcome to Citizen. Today we have one of my favorite people to interact with, Batya Ungar-Sargon. You are the deputy opinion editor for Newsweek, and you do a bunch of other stuff as well.
Yes,
right?
Correct. And I'm sure at this point your listeners know that you've written for us at Newsweek, pieces that are really important that they should all really, really head over and check out, because they're the kind of pieces that I think get to what we're going to talk about, but just overcoming that divide and, finding the truth beyond the polarization, of which there is a lot. So thanks for those great pieces.
Sure. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. So I've talked to you a lot about this project, this book, this show. You're one of the very few people in modern journalism that's taken the time to point out a lot of the unnecessary divisiveness that's going on, stuff that doesn't necessarily even make sense. It's just like people are picking teams because they feel like they need to in a lot of ways. You've been in this field for a long time. How do you frame all this? Like, where do you feel like things started to go wrong for media and the national discourse?
That's such a great question. I mean, I think to me, as someone who cares a lot about the class divide, which I think is driving a lot of this, I think a lot of the kind of 90s era economic policy where the Democrats really joined hands with Republicans to abandon the working class in favor of sort of open borders, free trade style thinking. To me, stuff like that, NAFTA, globalization, outsourcing of these great working class, middle class jobs to China, that was both a symptom and a cause of the divide. Because what ended up happening was, up through the 70s, you had so much economic mobility, social mobility, even for the working class. I mean, most working class Americans in the 70s were living solidly middle class lifestyles. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, had a huge minimizing effect on ideological polarization, because people were living in sort of mixed income, mixed political parties, neighborhoods. They were in community with people who they disagreed with. What happened over the course of the last 50 years is there was this great sorting to where you had anybody who could make it in the knowledge industry, abandon sort of small town America, rural America. I'm speaking broadly in generalizations, but move to the cities, get these knowledge industry jobs. And once in those jobs, what they started to do was create an economy that worked really well for people in knowledge industry jobs and really poorly for anybody who works with their hands or drives for a living or creates things for a living or makes things for a living. And I think that sort of class stratification, that's really where polarization started, because it was essentially a great distraction for the side that was supposed to be on the side of the little guy who no longer was. So instead of being able to say to working class Americans, vote Democrat because we have your economic interest at heart, they knew that was no longer the case. They had their own economic interests at heart, the elites. And so what they started to say was the other side is racist, the other side hates women, the other side is domestic terrorists, right? Which is what we have now. So to me, it's really bound up in like the economic story. But I'm really interested in what you think. Like, where do you think it started and what do you think it stems from?
No, I agree with that. I think it's just the natural fruition of the magician's patter that is politics, right? The here's the real problem, but look over here. Here's the shiny set of keys. Now you talk about this is actually something you discuss pretty frequently, is the Democratic Party abandoning the working class. I would add to that in the late 90s and early 2000s, the Republican Party abandoned the liberty class as well, with nation building
Yeah.
wars and mass surveillance and all this other stuff. And they also abandoned the conservative minded class because they expanded the government at a rate we've never seen before. So it's almost like we're still trying to we're trying to play baseball with football pads almost, right? Like none of the items that are working as intended. So we're left in a situation where maybe it is just the ideological differences that are left to fight over because everything else is too confusing. Maybe like nobody's doing what they're supposed to do. Words don't mean what they once did. You talk about the great sorting. That's a really good point about the technology industry and how a lot of people abandon rural America. And obviously the result of that is going to be concentrated centers in highly liberal areas. And you will have, as you will in any liberal area, you'll have a lot of leftists. But then you have a lot of people who are just browbeaten into accepting leftism so they can just go about their lives and do work, right? Do you think that the work from home stuff that's happened over the last 2 years is going to have some inverse effect where we unsort ourselves back out into, the hinterland of America?
It was so funny because there was this one week when the host on Fox News they had been crowing about how all these, everybody's abandoning the big liberal cities to move to rural America. And then there was this one week where they realized like, oh my God, they're all coming to where we live and they're going to start voting. It was really funny. I have to say, I think that I think we're already in something of a woke lash because it's become so clear how little appetite Black and Hispanic Americans have for this nonsense. And so to me, like the spread has almost, I think it's reached its the apex. And I think that we're already in a moment of people, I mean, for the first time in my life, after the left won a series of extremely important civil rights gains on issues like, civil rights for Black Americans, for gay and lesbian Americans, for women, for the first time in my life, because of left-wing overreach, because they sort of won all those really important wars and then moved way too far. They were like, well, what are we going to fight for now? And started fighting for crazy things. Americans are becoming more conservative, I think. And you're seeing that not just in like their electoral preferences, but I think, to me, the importance of your project is that it is really speaking to Americans where I think they are at right now, which is, no one's coming to save us. We have to save ourselves, and we have to save ourselves by reinvesting in what makes us Americans and reinvesting in each other, not from a like big government top down kind of a way, but from a question of like, what do we owe each other as Americans? Like how do we rebuild the texture of American life so that it's thick enough to sustain ourselves beyond these sort of failed institutions? And I think that to me is why your project is so important.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I'm thinking. It's very easy to monolith things. It's very easy to look at large institutions and say, this institution is corrupt. So I'm going to become cynical or nihilistic about it. And I feel like that's where I really feel like the silent majority, the silent millions, that's a large portion, if not a majority, are in that position now. They're just like, I'm tired of hearing about this stuff. I'm going to tune out. And it has the same effect as what we've done up until this point to allow this to happen in the first place. You're exactly, nobody would ever start building anything from the top down, right? Like that doesn't make any sense. And when there are structural issues in anything, whether it's, society or an institution or like literally in a building, the first place you look is the places that that support all the weight, and that's the people. Not only do we support all the weight, but we also we're generally the foundation in a bottom-up society, which is what we want. If the bottom sucks, then the whole thing's going to suck. You know what I mean? I mean, that's just kind of how it is. I think we've spent enough time complaining and blaming everybody else for our own problems. It's really interesting because the people that would call themselves citizen, that consider themselves libertarian or conservative or classical liberal, or people that care about America, will go a long way in indicting their opponents, I guess, their political opponents. Like, you guys are all victims. You do this, you do that. But what exactly is it that we're doing? You know what I mean? Like, if a government, I said this on another show, if the government's going to be of, for, and by the people, the only way it's ever going to be good is if the people are good, right? And it's not enough to be good; you have to do good.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is key, and I'm working on a project now about, who is the American working class and what do they want? What are their aspirations? What are their goals? I talk to working class Americans every day, and what they tell me is often very surprising, So for example, wages, big problem, a big issue, a big concern. They don't support a national minimum wage because it makes no sense to have a national minimum wage. And a lot of them will tell me,
Right.
I will lose my job if that happens, because they have to worry about their small, their employer, right? If it's a small business. And something, but that doesn't mean that the rights kind of trickle down, free market bootstrapping is the answer. I mean, that is also very alien. I think that the difference between bootstrapping and autonomy is extremely important, because, autonomy is, I want to have control over my life. I want to have control over my destiny. I want to have a say over what happens to me. That can be taken away from you by things like the free market, or when it's working against you. And so what I'll often say to conservatives is, okay, we can agree a national minimum wage won't work, but what are you doing to make sure that the people you stand next to in church, who can't sleep at night because the next bill could mean homelessness to them, what are you doing for them from your point of view as a conservative? Or, for example, something I think is really important, single family income, being able to raise a family on that, right? That used to be a central tenet of the American dream. A father can work and support his family, and his wife can stay home and raise the children. Maybe she wants to go work later, great, but that she has that choice. They have that choice as a family. That's now not possible in the America of today. So I ask conservatives, well, okay, I agree with you. Yeah. Forget all this pre-K, free pre-K stuff. That's a ruse. Forget the big government answer. But what is your answer? What are you doing to create a culture in corporate America that is going to sustain families, working class families, on a single income, and allow us to get back to that American dream? And I totally agree with you. I think at this point, like, the answers are very much a question of a culture, but you have to create that culture from the bottom up. I mean, the workers, they want that. They know what it is, but it's the people who sort of have power. Okay, you want to have power? Great. Like, you don't want the government to take that? Great. What are you going to do from a cultural point of view to fix these problems that, like, leftists have been better at calling out, honestly?
Yes, for sure. And, just as a socially conscious person, somebody that wants, and any reasonable person, it should matter to you that your country is doing well, that your community is doing well, because not just because it's good, but also because it's good for you and your family, right? I mean, that's kind of the whole point of doing all this stuff. If you want to warn people off bad decisions and government intrusion, it's incumbent upon you to provide a better solution and your support in that solution, right? Otherwise, you're full of shit, frankly. I mean, otherwise, you're not doing anything. You're just pointing out flaws. And there's enough of that. I mean, I personally have had enough of the constant noise and rotation of pundits on both sides pointing out how bad everything is without any effort made to solve anything. It's very bizarre. So I want to get into this that was good preamble. I think we've kind of set the tone for this. I want to talk about this, what I think is the solution, something you hinted at before, which is, kind of bottom up reconstruction of our culture. And I think it starts with people being better citizens. That's the only thing you can really control. Like, I can't make other people vote for things. Most people can't organize rallies and do direct action, and you only have your one vote. But the two things you can't control, and I say this a lot, are your attitude and your effort. You can control both of those things. Nobody can stop you from controlling both of those things. So for me, I started looking at definitions, both like in the dictionary and in law libraries, and like in old writings, from when Western republics started to develop and what it meant to people. And my favorite definition of the word citizen, which I've said a couple of times in previous shows, is a legally recognized member of a state with associated rights and obligations. Now, going back to what I said before, the kind of leave me alone conservative libertarian crowd very frequently accuses, and rightfully so, a large portion of our society of being victims and putting social currency in victimhood and accepting their victim status and all that stuff. Boy, I mean, honestly, I can't think of a difference, a real difference between that and just saying my rights and ignoring my obligations and responsibilities, right? Like you've not taken anything into your own hands when you just complain about what you're not getting instead of putting in effort that you should be required to put in. That's like anything you do in life, a personal relationship, working out, educating yourself, anything pretty much that you do in life, you're going to get out of it some factor of what you put into it. And what is the average American putting into America right now?
Yeah.
I just don't know the answer to that. So I want to hear just a couple of thoughts from you on what you think it means. Like, you talk to working class people probably more than anybody in media right now. What do you think it means for the average American to be a good citizen and contribute to their culture and society?
It's such a great question. I mean, I think a lot of people are sort of just struggling to get by. That's sort of my biggest problem with the discourse right now, is that you have a kind of left that's hyper focused on the dependent poor, like people who really can't take care of themselves. Drug addicts, mentally ill people, people who are disabled, right? All of their attention is sort of on those people who the state, they believe the state should be taking care of. And anybody who's not in their sort of top 10%, they kind of want to affix to that bottom and have them all living on this very expanded welfare state, which is, of course, not what working class Americans want. And then on the right, you have this trickle down ideology where it's like, anything that works for the free market is going to work for everybody, which, it doesn't work that way. Like the free market was very happy to ship all of our a lot of great jobs to China and Mexico. And, you see the deaths of despair. 107,000 people committed death by opioids. That's not, those people are not being taken care of by the free market. And so basically the right is very focused on the top 5%, the rich, and the left is they are the top 10% and they're very focused on the bottom, but nobody's really speaking to the great middle. And that middle, of course, is very diverse economically. Some people have a solidly middle class life. They own their own homes, their kids are upwardly mobile. Some people are really working poor. I mean, they work and work and work and they can't crawl out of that hole. So it's very diverse. And I think, it depends where you are in that, in that makeup. My experience talking to working class Americans is that they are deeply patriotic. They care a lot about this country. They feel totally abandoned by both parties. Nobody represents them. There's nobody really speaking to, a socially conservative, but economically slightly more liberal person in America, even though they make up a quarter of Americans. They've been sort of erased from the, from the conversation. So I think for a lot of those people, like what it means to be an American is not exactly what you're describing, not to contribute to the hate and the divisiveness. Something I tell people a lot, I explore this a lot in my book, is that, every time you're on the internet and you see something that makes you feel enraged, a stranger said something and you feel that like, oh, I can't believe somebody thinks this, like it's very physical, feels like road rage almost. Every time you have that feeling about a stranger on the internet, someone just made $1 million. It's not normal to feel that way about a stranger. And they've really hacked us, and they've turned our hearts into like, the place where they make millions and millions and millions. I'm not kidding. It really is $1 million. Whether it's a media company or a social media company, like they're making their money off making you hate your fellow American. And you can say no to that every minute of every day. It's like hard. You have to train yourself. But every time you have that feeling, like that should not make you, every time you have that feeling, you should think, oh, wow, like the elites really want us to hate each other, because the more we hate each other, the less likely it is that we will start that work of building back up American society from the bottom up and be able to have a real constituency that can provide a countervailing force to their power.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, divide and conquer, right? If somebody's trying to divide you, then they are 100% trying to conquer you. One thing follows the other. You know me, I'm not a religious person, but this wisdom is thousands of years old. It's in the New Testament in Titus. It says something to the effect of warn a divisive man once and then warn him a second time, but don't warn him a third, have nothing to do with him anymore. And it's difficult to know when to apply that. You know what I mean? Like, I think what we're looking for is a good balance between empathy and accountability. You know what I mean? Like taking the time to understand why somebody's upset and letting them know that you understand, or letting them know that you're trying to understand, but also letting them know that you're not gonna, just accept their poor behavior, I think is a really interesting concept. It's one that our buddy Schellenberger, his research on homelessness and drug addiction is so good in that, because it found that just giving them housing, which was a premise for a lot of progressive cities, on the outside, you get about 90 days out of those people before they're recidivists, right? But if you tie their housing, you can give them free housing, but if you make them get a job and pass a drug test, then now they're in there for like long-term, like years. And it makes sense. I mean, that's how we teach children. I don't know why people find it demeaning. Like certainly the strategy changes when you're trying to train people in different circumstances, different levels of intelligence, different levels of education and stuff like that. But the principles are basically the same, right? I mean, it's classical or operant conditioning, or you're using parables to teach lessons that are broader than just the specific example giving in that parable. You know what I mean? It's something that you can take with you and use in other places in life. But I think it's tribalism is probably inevitable, right? Because that's how our brains work. Our brains are best at identifying threats and benefits. And if something isn't clearly a benefit to us, then we're going to associate it as a threat. Typically, that's just how the human brain works. It's how all mammal brains work. Tribalism isn't going anywhere. So maybe we can teach people through our words and effort that they can base their tribe on something that actually matters. You know what I mean? So does race, and for the vast majority of people in this country, does race and gender ideology and right-left politics and things like that, do they really affect your life? And other than just making you angry on the internet? The answer to that is very clearly no. And you can see it in exit polling for every major election we have. None of them show that people are voting because of that stuff. It's never because of that. But this idea of putting power back in anybody's hand, or into everybody's hands, like you do this and the result will be this. It's the IKEA effect. Are you familiar with that? Excuse me. So the IKEA effect is a psychological phenomenon where if somebody buys a product that's unassembled, and even if they just assemble the last 20%, it's called the 80-20 rule. If they just assemble it the last 20%, they feel a greater sense of
Oh,
ownership over it
wow.
because they did something. Yeah. So I
Oh,
think
that's so interesting.
what I want to do here is give people, like briefly lay the background, but I think everybody's pretty aware of what's going on, but also give them some ideas and tools for things they can do in their life and discussions they can have with other people that will empower the bottom, you know what I mean? I guess to displace the top, because right now the top is it may seem like a pyramid because of the numbers, but if you made the pyramid based on the amount of power and comfort, then that pyramid would be
Or
inverted, right?
potential power, maybe. Yeah,
Right.
for
Yeah.
sure.
So we're here today, specifically, you chose to talk about the principle, I will reject divisiveness in all its forms. What does that mean to you?
I just think that it ties into everything we've been talking about. I remember, I had the Trump derangement syndrome, and one of the things that made me stop having it was just I was so sick of feeling angry and powerless. Like, it's just such an obvious thing. I was just so sick of feeling that way. I thought there has to be a way out of that feeling. And it turned out the way out of that feeling was to have a much more objective sense of like who this person was, what his failings actually are, but also what his successes were and why he was a tribune for so many people that I care about personally. That feeling of powerlessness comes from the fact that people are using our hearts to get power, and they have enslaved our emotions to their profit motive, and we have to say no to that because it's led to such a disaster. Like you said, the inverted triangle, the people at the top have so much power and there's so few of them. I mean, we're headed towards, if we're not already in an oligarchy, in this post-pandemic world where we saw the greatest transfer of wealth from the working and middle class to the oligarchs at the top, to the billionaire class. It's enraging, but we can't get stuck in that place of like, oh, it's enraging, these people who are supposed to represent us do nothing for us, they expect us to represent them and to be their foot soldiers. And honestly, I think I learned a lot about this from people who are not in the elites, because people, working class Americans, are extremely post-partisan. I mean, that's not to say that they don't vote. A lot of people vote, but they work alongside other people who have different politics than them, and they just don't care at all. I mean, the whole polarization phenomenon is a totally elite phenomenon. It's for people who are making money off of it and getting power off of it, and that's it. And everybody else can see through it at this point. And so I think, I am religious, so to me it's very spiritual. It's a spiritual practice to say like, no, we're not going to allow this to divide us, because what unites us as Americans is so much more important. And how dare they try to make us hate each other at a time when we've never been more united about the most important values that this country was founded on, in order to make money and get power. It's appalling. So I guess I would say that's what it means to me. Yeah, it's like take a page out of, workers' notebooks. And I talk to people all the time who are like, yeah, they're, they're in a union, and 75% of the union is conservative and 25% is liberal. And yeah, things get heated when abortion comes up in the break room or whatever. But, I hear over and over again, good wages, safety in the workplace, benefits, like this stuff should not be partisan. This stuff is so much beyond it. And I hear other things like, exactly like you were saying, maybe I'm doing okay, but if my neighbor's not doing okay, if there's substance abuse in my neighbor's home, if their house is falling apart, where's my kid going to go and play, right? Like who are they going to talk to? And on the question of housing, I just want to say, I think it's so interesting you brought it up. I think the reason Michael Schellenberger's work is so important is because it really reveals, again, like how the interests of the working class and the interests of the poor are not the same, but the left is hyper focused on the poor. So what they want to do is build these like there's like a housing crisis, right? Like American families cannot afford to buy homes that they will pass on to their children. So what's the left's answer? It's to build high rises and give homeless drug addicts apartments. It's like ridiculous. They're going to trash them because they don't own them, right? What they want is for every working class family who can't afford a home to be in Section 8 housing. It's like, that's not what they want. That's not an answer. But then you look at the right, it's like, well, what's their answer to the housing crisis? Nothing. The free market will take care. Of course, it's not going to take care of it. You look at, housing in New York, you have these situations where liberal cities have become like very feudal. So you have these like elites living in like homes that really nice homes they own, and they have Amazon, packages delivered to them from people who could never dream of even renting in these neighborhoods, right? They have to travel like, 2 hours to get to work because they live out in the outskirts. It's like very poor and very rich and nothing in between. So just rejecting divisiveness, I think, is super important because, both sides are failing to represent, working class Americans. Both sides actually do have a little piece of the puzzle. Like, I think marriage is very important. You hear that a lot from conservatives. It's very important to economic mobility. Housing is a really important thing. You hear that from the left, although they don't really have the right solutions. So just remembering that more unites us as Americans than divides us. Like, that's the only way that we get out of this.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the ownership thing is super interesting to me. As I said, the IKEA effect.
Genius.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, what's the, what should we expect culture to be like if, Klaus Schwab gets his wish, and that's that you'll own nothing and you'll be happy, right? Like that sounds very like I'll own nothing, so I'll have no real purpose in life, which we know is one of the leading causes of depression and suicide. I think the and you'll be happy part is because they're planning to dose us up with soma, right? I mean that's the inevitable solution to that problem. But I think about the ownership of not just property, although that's a huge deal for middle class people in their economic state, because the vast majority of wealth created by middle class people is in the equity in their mortgage throughout their lifetime. There's a large supplement in the form of 401ks now, but it's still primarily the vast majority of money they pass on from one generation to the next is through property that they own. So not only are we creating this situation where upward mobility is a problem, but now it's intergenerational upward mobility is a problem. And that is the foundation of a caste system, right? That's how that happens, is that these people are poor for 3 generations. So, that's the Smith family. They're poor. They've always been poor. They will always be poor. That's unacceptable. Like all of these things that we treasure about the American experiment, the liberty, the opportunity, it only exists if it exists for everyone. So that's the part that I always come back to when we're discussing divisiveness. It's none of these things that you think matter. I think it's important to have these conversations, because when you see somebody that's different than you or thinks differently than you, your brain is doing its job correctly when it identifies that as a potential threat. It's supposed to work that way. I think we need to accept that as a reality, because that's how our brains work. Sunlight's the best disinfectant, right? So just tell the truth. Tell the truth. Explain exactly what's happening. Like, hey, I see you. The conservatives have been really critical of these implicit bias tests, but of course that's what is happening. We've got 250,000 years of evolution programmed into our brain that something that looks different than me, that has like slightly longer fingers or something, because they may have retractable claws, that might be a threat now. So I have to worry about that. That's how your brain is functioning properly when it makes that distinction. But we are sentient creatures now that have language and culture, and it's unacceptable to rely simply on your base instincts. That's the conversation that needs to be had. Not that I'm colorblind. That's nonsense, right? Nobody's color. You shouldn't be colorblind. Why would you be? You should recognize things for what they are. And we've done ourselves a great disservice by not stating that plainly, that all of this divisiveness is inevitable, but it's also curable. We've cured it before. Like warring factions have become friends time and time again. We're pretty good friends with Japan now. And we're the only country to ever drop a nuke on somebody, and they're the only country to have a nuke dropped on them. And we are the best of friends now. And I don't, I say that kind of tongue in cheek, but that's the reality, right? Japan decided to abandon their short-lived imperialism and do what they do really well, right? And join the world community. And they did it because we helped them. Like, yeah, we were at war with them. Obviously, we forced an unconditional surrender and blah, blah, blah. But after that, in Europe and in Japan, the Marshall Plan and the plan in Japan to rebuild their economies and get them sorted back into where was that in Iraq and Afghanistan? At what point did we try to take the natural industries of Iraq and Afghanistan and export them to the world without any benefit to ourselves? You know what I mean? To give them an economy. That there's no better solution to war than people having jobs. I just don't know. We can't have any of these conversations unless people are willing to agree on the very basic fundamental facts of the case, which is, yes, we are all divisive by nature. We are tribalistic by nature. But we now, as intelligent, sentient, cultured people, have the ability to redefine what our tribe is. And that's something that I think is super important. And I wonder how we do that, because I want to hear your thoughts on this, especially about the working class. More and more, as you said before, the working class is made of a mixture of white rural Americans and Black Americans and Hispanic Americans. That's the majority of that group. And to be honest, aside from a few I guess you could call them wedge issues, those people more or less agree on everything, right? They just want to live comfortable lives, own property, raise their kids, blah, blah, blah. But there's still a lot of distrust among those groups. And I wonder what we can do to solve that particular issue. I'm not sure. Like, I don't like struggle sessions. I don't want to force people to do things they don't want to do or any of that.
Is there still?
I don't think it works.
Still like tension between? I mean, so many data points come to mind. Like, okay, so the first is do you know that Yale study from 2018? So that study found that white liberals and white conservatives are different in how they talk to Blacks and Hispanics. And it found that white liberals dumb down their vocabulary and white conservatives don't, right? I remember I was telling my friend Denisha about this, and she went, oh yeah, I know. We all know that. Like, we all know that liberals do that and conservatives don't. It's like, I remember when I first read that and I was like, and we call them the racist. Like, that's so racist. That just that implicit need to like cater to, that sort of woke thing where you assume this person needs your help, right? It's so gross.
I think Thomas Sowell, is the one that said this back in the 90s, as a matter of fact, a long time ago. I think he called it the subtle racism of lowered expectations or something like that. He was talking about affirmative action, but I think that was the phrase he used, the subtle racism of lowered expectations. But I don't think there's widespread tension between any of those groups of people. What I think is there's been very little effort by anybody with the ability to do so to rally all of those groups together and be like, hey, these like 4 or 5 things, these fundamental things that make the most sense in your life are identical to this other group. And there's this other group up here that's trying to, make you all hate each other. You guys have to get together and stop them somehow, right? And it isn't like by force. You can't stop something. Boy, I wish people would realize this. You can't stop ideas by force. That's not how that works. Bad ideas are stopped by better ideas or good ideas. So I wonder, you talk to working class people a lot. Pretty much everybody that listens to this show is in that group. Aside from just doing shows like this and publications, I wonder what the average person can do as their, life is busy and stuff. But what can we instruct the average person to do to take back some of that power and build alliances with people that can help them fight back against this?
That's a really great question. I mean, I think they're already doing it. I mean, like in some ways, like the fact that there's no, that they have rejected, that many of these people have rejected the polarization that their politicians want them to turn into their beating hearts, right? That to me is like so incredible, like given what they're up against, in this struggle to attain the American dream, like that they have refused and continue to refuse the easy outs. And I'm talking about like, Hispanic working class people living on the border, Black working class people living in the South, refusing to buy into that hatred, refusing to allow this to divide them. That to me is like really humbling and inspiring. Like, what the fuck is my excuse if these people can be like, you know what, I'm not going to accept that language. So I'm taking my lead from them. But yeah, how do they get power out? How do they turn that into power? I think that is a really important question. And of course, it's like bound up in everything you're talking about, taking responsibility for your life and everything. But how do you sort of use that in order to create a real force that can compete against the elites?
Yeah, because all of these elites are trying to weaponize that power either entirely or in small subsects against each other right now. I mean, so you know that there is legitimate, useful, intrinsic power in this situation because it's being exploited by people who have an axe to grind, right? So how does I guess how do all of us reclaim the fruits of our social labor?
Yeah, the social capital. It's such an important question because I'm thinking now specifically about, well, so one thing you're seeing is parents really taking back power over like their kids' education, and that's great, but a lot of that is happening in sort of upper class places like Loudoun County. You go to places like rural Arkansas, or communities of color where there's like Black parents who know that their kids are being talked down to. They know their kids are being patronized and not taught how to read, but they're working 2-3 jobs. Like they don't have time to go to they don't have time to go and stand up for their children's rights and themselves because of the economic reality. I think that, something that's really important is, so listening to your podcast, I going into that assumed, obviously like everybody from your background is a Republican, right? Like that was totally wrong. Turns out you guys hate everybody, right? Like that thing you said about daylight being a disinfectant. Like, so for example, something people don't realize is that, they think that this progressive agenda represents 50% of Americans, but actually only 6% of Americans identify as progressive, and only 6% of Black Americans identify as progressive. And that means, for example, so I'm getting these numbers from Pew, and Pew asked people, like, one of the ways that you got into the progressive camp was they said, do you agree with the statement that America's institutions are so deeply racist that they need to be razed to the ground and rebuilt from the bottom up, right? That's, if you said yes, you were put in the progressive camp. Just 6% of Black Americans are in that camp that said yes to that wholeheartedly. Over 90% of progressives said yes to that. So it's like the people that, that the elites are trying to tell you, give them moral credibility, they're not in their corner. You know what I mean? They're way on the other side. Something like abortion, right? Yeah, the majority of Black Americans still vote for Democrats, 85-90%. But abortion is a very complex issue in the Black community. Most Black Americans are very ambivalent about the topic. Just the more you can reject the thinking that gives the elites powers, because they're just lying about all of this stuff, right? It's their economic interests that they're representing and nobody else's. And like you said, daylight, like talk to people and assume your fellow American is a good person and agrees with you. But even if they don't agree with you, that they maybe have a good reason for it. They maybe something worth learning. I find that the most dangerous ideas are the ones that I end up being true, right? Like, so, I remember like, the first time I heard, Heather McDonald, right? And I thought to myself, my God, turn this off. This is so dangerous. It wasn't because it was hate speech, it's because, when I was ready to like actually honestly encounter the work 3 months later, I was like, God, like this, this sounds true. Like there's something here that like
Yeah.
sounds like probably, going to look more into it. But that's where the danger comes, I think. And we have, like you said, this tribal knee-jerk response to like, if we hear something that threatens our status, like we want to run away from it, right? We want to demonize anybody who thinks it. But, when you take that out of the picture, I think it's, that thing where we're sharing power ends up happening sort of as a byproduct almost.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's a lot easier to ignore a problem. It's a lot easier to step over a homeless person or walk past a piece of garbage on the ground or whatever, because we see it all the time. People will, somebody will fall down in public and everybody will avert their gaze, and they do it. I think they tell themselves they do it because they don't want to shame the other person or they want to spare them some embarrassment. But in reality, they're doing it because they don't want to accept responsibility and go help that person. I think that's what it is. And to the other point you made, you're basically describing the principle of charity, right? It's like a first century Jewish principle. Well, I don't know if it's necessarily a Jewish principle, but a rabbi in the first century or second century, I'm sorry, came up with it. And the principle of charity says you take people at their best possible meaning. You don't like we're in a culture now of, so what you're saying is ... and then the worst possible meaning of what they just said. Like, what is the point of that? That there's no, we've been around, these are misers. That's a miser attitude. That's a person that's like, hey, isn't this steak good? Oh yeah, I mean, it could be better. Like, what the fuck does that mean, dude? Like, if that's your attitude on life, you may as well just get out of the way because you're not helping anyone. Now, to your point about people coming together, rejecting the narrative, I suppose, of the elitists. This is how marriage equality happened in America. It wasn't because of pride rallies or bills in Congress. It's because people started coming out, and people who were confused about or whatever, didn't understand or had some kind of ethical or religious issue with it, started to realize that my neighbors, my family members, people I love are just gay. It just happens. And then you see like really interesting science about gametes in utero and how that affects people. And it's like, oh, that's just something that happens naturally. I find it very hard to believe that somebody that believes in the benevolence of whatever deity they believe in would think that that deity would create somebody to live a tortured life for no apparent reason. Like, that's nonsense, right? So, but it's the experience. It's so maybe one of the things we can do, because look, I agree with you, and the polling agrees. We live in a very nearly post-racial society. Obviously, you're never going to be fully post-racial because of tribalism, because there's going to be crazy people. But until, I guess, the woke industrial complex became a thing, no one really cared about any of that anymore. But that's the rejection part. But that only gets you so far, right? That's a black pill. Like, you still have to get back involved in the process and reclaim your power. I don't know what that looks like. I don't want to say like, oh, go have barbecues with your black neighbors. Like, what the fuck does that mean? But it's something like that, right? It's deciding to find people. The greatest common factor, right? So you compare your system of beliefs and your wants and desires and your culture to other people. And instead of saying, here are all the differences, you say, here are all the similarities. Here are all the things that we can come together on. The differences will sort themselves out over time. And if we live in a place where people believe in the fundamentals, and I would say the vast majority of people believe in the same general things: life, liberty, happiness, you know what I mean, taking care of other people. All those other things seem to take care of themselves, right? I just don't know, and hopefully we'll discover through the process of doing all these shows some real world examples of how people from different cultures can get together and realize how similar they are. Like, that's one of one of the biggest goals that I have in the show. Um, yeah, so it's about two weeks ago we had on my other show we had a very devout, religious former Navy SEAL. He's like an ultra marathon runner, very interesting guy. And, he went on a couple of tangents about his religious beliefs and stuff. And, our audience knows who I am. I don't know what they expected me to do. I'm not going to be rude, but my response to him was when he was making statements. I'm like, yeah, so here's absent of any kind of religion, here's how you and I agree on all these things. You know what I mean? Like, find a way to make what you believe agree with what other people believe instead of trying to point out the differences all the time. That seems like a useful endeavor, and it also will help you learn quite a bit about their culture.
Yeah, absolutely. Get used to feeling like you owe it to other people to make the best case for your beliefs rather than, that you're obviously right and they're terrible for not already agreeing with you. Yeah.
Right. Well, that's academic
Yeah.
rigor, right? Like, if you can't steel man the other
Yeah.
person's argument, then you don't understand yours or theirs, frankly. So one of the other things about divisiveness is it's really easy, and we see it in the workplace a lot, and you probably maybe I don't know if you've actually looked into this or not, but you've probably experienced quite a bit of it. When things get tough, when people are struggling to get by, when there's a high operational tempo at your work, when there's a lot of stress, when maybe some things aren't going well, people seem to develop this attitude that I'm doing all the work and everybody else isn't doing anything. And they start to get bitter and cynical about the process. And then that's, to me, is a microcosm for the social, the societal decay that's happening in America right now. It's very important for people to learn how to take a deep breath when they're angry. Like Jordan Peterson says, stand up tall with your shoulders back. That's good advice. I would say take a deep breath when you're angry is good advice as well. Because if it's a fleeting anger and you overreact, then you've wasted time. You have to repair a relationship. You've made your life and your relationship, maybe your job, less efficient. You've done a lot of damage in that very short amount of time. But maybe worse is if you are actually legitimately mad, like if the reason you're angry has a point, how have you communicated that in a way that's going to fix it instead of just letting your anger distract you?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And that seems like what we're doing right now. So what are these elite patricians doing with my tax dollars and my liberty while I'm angry at my neighbor?
Yeah, definitely.
That seems like a question that people should ask themselves anytime. Like, if you're cruising Twitter or Instagram or Facebook and you see something about some other group of people or somebody saying something from a different political angle and it makes you angry, you should immediately ask yourself that question. What's happening with my tax dollars and my liberty while I'm squabbling over this wedge issue?
Definitely. And I think also it's one of the reasons why getting married, having kids, being part of a community, going to synagogue or church, or if you're not religious, volunteering, having communal ties is extremely important because when you're supporting a family, if something goes wrong at work, you don't have that luxury anymore of just saying, fuck it, I'm out of here. Right. Like, because people are depending on you. And sometimes you need to, say I'm out of here, but often, like those communal ties, like they don't just give you that sort of, burden, but, sacred burden that you're representing others. But I think being in a community where you see yourself reflected back, with admiration by people who you have done things for, it's really, really important. I remember I was at a job where I didn't feel respected and it was really challenging. I got a lot of crap and but I would go to synagogue and my rabbi really respects me and my fellow community members do, and we're in this fellowship together, and that bolsters you. It gives you, I think humans really need to feel admired at some deep level. Like, We need to feel like we are contributing, and that is how you get that admiration, is by giving to others. And obviously I struggle with this. I'm a deeply narcissistic, selfish person, but anytime that I feel low, when you give to somebody else, like, that makes you feel, you can see that, I mean, you feel yourself to be an admirable person. And I think that that bolsters you in situations where you might be feeling resentful and thinking, oh, he's getting what's really mine. Like, we all have those feelings, like, he's getting ahead, how come I'm not, and I think definitely, yeah, if there's like an ethnic divide or a religious divide, it's very easy to, I think that amps up that feeling. But that person is, you guys are struggling, you're in the same struggle against, like, like you keep coming back to, Dan, like the powers that be. What are they doing with our stuff and our liberties while we're squabbling over here?
Yeah, and that's where they want you. They want you arguing amongst yourself. It's American politics is the modern Roman Colosseum. You know what I mean? It's a distraction. It's
Totally.
where they're throwing us breadcrumbs into the audience, to keep us distracted while they pillage both our
Yeah.
our wealth and our liberty. And to your point, yeah, we talked about this yesterday. You have to start training yourself again to say, instead of saying why them when somebody is successful, you say why not me too.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? You should like train yourself to be inspired by other people's success, not
Totally.
intimidated by it, because it is a true statement that a rising tide lifts all boats. I don't mean literally in water, although that is true technically, but the better we all do, the better we all do. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's a fact of life. So it's like the thing you're talking about, engaging in your community, it's the modern posse, right? I talked about this a little bit yesterday as well. There's no, up until the 20th century, there was no professional police force in the United States. As a matter of fact, most countries didn't have a professional police force. In the United States in particular, though, it lasted quite a bit longer than other places because we were pretty spread out, right? Like major cities had a lot of private security and stuff like that, but there weren't 750,000 sworn police officers and a bunch of deputy sheriffs and all this stuff. So people depended on, you would have a sheriff in your town who represented legal authority and was capable of deputizing anybody, right,
Mm-hmm.
to help them out. And that was the expectation. The expectation was that if things go wrong for one of your neighbors, you get off your ass and you go help, because one, it's the right thing to do, and because two, at some point it's going to happen to you, and you want that infrastructure to exist to help you in your time of need. What is the modern American put into that infrastructure, right? I that's a real question I have. Like, people, unless you've served in the military or done extensive volunteer work or something like that, or been a first responder, what exactly have you put into the infrastructure that you're so ready to criticize?
Yeah, I was going to say, like, you and your listeners have put in, quite a bit,
Sure, yeah, but I mean that's something that I tell people that have left military service and public service in general, as first responders. Like, your service never ends. That's the point. You know what I mean? That's what all of us believe, and it's why I think it was a big factor in the vet suicide crisis that persists to a lesser degree, slightly lesser degree. It's still a big problem, but people whose entire identity was wrapped up in the service of others, all of a sudden were left to service, just themselves, I guess. And that feels very empty to a person like me. I say this a lot, and it kind of sounds like a platitude. And it doesn't really, for people that witness my demeanor and style, it may not necessarily fit with the vibe I put off, but the most important things you do in life won't be for yourself. And when I say important, I don't mean in some ephemeral measure like, oh, this was 20% more ethical than that or anything like that. I mean the stuff that will benefit your life the most, that'll make you the happiest, that will give you the most peace, that will give you the most satisfaction. They will not be things that you do for yourself. They will be things done in the service of others. And uh, that is one of the foundational points of being a citizen. And I don't mean an American citizen, I mean just a citizen in general, is the recognition that all of this only exists if it exists for everybody. It only exists if we all put in our fair share. And it only exists if we reject the divisiveness and believe in it together, regardless of who comes along and tries to teach us otherwise. That's the only way that any of this really works. And it's the only way that our government could work too, is if we hold to that standard. If we have a government of, for, and by the people, and the people suck, then the government sucks. That's how that works, right? Like if you build a house out of shitty materials, you have a shitty
That's a
house.
really good point.
But if you build a house out of good materials, then you have a good house. I mean, why should we expect
Right.
otherwise? And what other social aspect or physical aspect in the physical world can you put in shitty effort, bad attitude, and bad product and expect a good result?
Right.
It just doesn't make any sense.
AOC and Dan Crenshaw were both raised in America as Americans, right? Like we bear responsibility for them too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've taught people like that one, power is attractive, and that maybe that's true for some people, but we've also taught them that celebrity and acceptance and popularity are more important than
Yeah.
principles, and that's where they are now, right?
Yeah.
They are a product of our own
Yeah.
hands. All of this, we are the author of our own issues here, and that, I think that's an important realization to make, and it's one of the things actually you recommended that I, instead of just what I plan to do, which is outline ways to be a better citizen and things like that. But you recommended that I challenge people, right?
Yeah.
Like, what are you doing? Not just like some
Yeah.
be nice to your neighbor nonsense, but like all of this misery that's around us right now, we did that. You may not have run for office or voted for the wrong people or whatever, but we all
Yeah.
allowed it to happen. We allowed ourselves to get to where we are right now. And that sounds, it sounds rough. I mean, it sounds like, man, that's a very depressing fact to think about, that I'm responsible for all of this, that we are collectively, all the people that I actually do like and respect, we're also responsible for all this. It can be a bad thing if you leave it there. But the good news is that if you created it, you can uncreate it,
100%.
right?
Yeah. I think it's
If you have the power, if we had the power to do that, then we have the power to
100%.
undo
I
it.
think it's a very hopeful thing to say, because
Mm,
if somebody else made it, you have no ability to fix it. If you made it, you can fix
right.
it, like every single one of you. And I think you have the moral credibility to make that, given how much you've sacrificed for this nation. Like you have the moral credibility to show up and say, all right, look, this is what I did, and now this is what I'm going to expect, and we're going to do it together, and I'm going to be there every step of the way.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it should be an empowering thing. And the inverse of it explains why people are so disenfranchised with the American political
Totally.
system, because they feel like, well, I voted for this person and the other person got into office and did all this stuff. It's not quite that simple, is it? I mean, it's not as simple as casting a vote once every 2 years and then hoping for the best. That's not a game plan. That's a recipe for disaster, because if you sit out the process, and I don't mean voting, if you sit out the process of running this country, from your family to your community to your state to your country, if you sit out the process, then you allow yourself to be ruled by lesser men. And that is unacceptable. It should be unacceptable in this country. All right. So we're going to wrap up here. Do you have any other thoughts that you'd like to share with the audience about this project or anything you've got going on? Please go ahead.
I'm very excited about the project. I think a lot of people are going to be we're waiting for something like this. And yeah, it just fills me with hope. And that's a really important feeling to have. So I'm excited to keep following along.
Oh, thank you. We appreciate you spending some time with us today, and I appreciate all of you for watching and listening. This has been Citizen.